What's up, punters? The NDIS has been in the news, and punters, I'll tell you, they're lying to you about the true cost of the NDIS, its growth rate, and their plan to get costs down. So punters, in this video, I'm going to go through the government's plan to reduce NDIS expenditure and whether it really makes sense. And punters, you can let me know that in the comments below. And here, I'm going to be doing a bit of a reaction to a reaction to a reaction to a reaction. To begin with, Pavlou and Zagoulis produced a video exposing NDIS fraud. Then Friendly Jordies reacted to that video, and then Punters Politics reacted to the video, and then Topher Field reacted to that reaction. And punters, here I'm going to be reacting to all of those reactions. So let's get into it. Alright, so cringe, punter style introduction aside, let's have a look at what exactly is happening. Because, as it turns out, Punters Politics, as is often the case, is incorrect. Punters Politics has dissected part of the problem of the NDIS, being the runaway spending, and has come to the precisely wrong conclusion about the problem, asserting that it's because of the private sector. And, in fact, it is not because of the private sector, rather, it turns out it's because of the government. So, as some background, the NDIS is Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme. It was set up quite some time ago, and it was let to run out of control. In essence, spending has been growing significantly year on year. It's come down from double digits to being about 7 to 8% per annum growth, which is incredibly high. Indeed, far too high for any government program to continue growing at. Because let's face it, if it's growing faster than the non-government GDP, then the tax revenue is not there to pay for it. And even if you do a tax hike right now, if the economy is growing slower than the spending, well then the tax is not going to keep up with it. And indeed, if you hike taxes, well then the growth rate in the economy is going to go down, and that is going to lead to less tax revenue being generated to spend on all of these other various miscellaneous expenditures in the NDIS. So we need to get spending growth under control. Now, it's been asserted that part of the problem behind this is because there are private sector operators who have leached into this program, have latched onto it, and are effectively expropriating money from the government, either committing fraud or simple over-servicing or pumping up bills in order to extract more money, and even if it's legal, it might be rather too expensive. Now, indeed, that is part of the problem. After all, as Charlie Munger asserted, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. But the problem here is how the incentives are set up. And in particular, the problem is the fact that the government appears to have unlimited sources of funding to just throw at the NDIS, which causes expenditure to get out of control. So to look at part of the problem here, in an ordinary supply and demand situation, what we have is the amount of quantity demanded of a good goes down as the price goes up, and the quantity supplied increases as the price goes up, and you get an equilibrium where the two supply and demand curves cross over. The problem with the NDIS is the demand curve actually increases with price. So to see why this is the case, when you've got prices go up for healthcare and the like, well, there's now more demand for the government to pay for it relative to the private sector. So people start shifting from paying for it themselves to getting the government to pay for it, which means the greater the price in the private sector, the more demand there is for the government to step in and pay for it, which causes demand to go up with price in the NDIS. It's slightly paradoxical, and it sends precisely the wrong signal to the market. Rather than demand going down as prices increase, demand amongst the population increases, and this is because there's seemingly unlimited rivers of gold that people can just tap into. Because it appears the entry criteria to get into the NDIS were incredibly loose, and the amount of funding one would get would be this big pot of money that could be spent, and that big pot of money would then be satisfied by increasing costs. And the problem here, of course, is we've got the price signaled the wrong way around. Ordinarily, in a private market, as prices go up, the quantity demanded decreases. But like I just asserted, as prices in the private sector go up, the quantity of NDIS demanded increases. That is a huge problem. So you get not only an upward sloping demand curve, but an upward sloping supply curve, and the two of these crosses over at a higher point, meaning you get more quantity being demanded. And in a demand-driven system such as the NDIS, this leads to more and more spending going on. It is a massive problem in the NDIS, and something that really needs to be resolved. And Mark Butler, the health minister, to give him some credit, has at least attempted to do this. It's too little too late, but attempting to do it. Now that's part of the problem. Now the problem, of course, is, as Drew Pavlou and Pete Zagoulis have pointed out, there appear to be pockets of fraud or over-servicing. And indeed, I've investigated this, and I find some rather suspicious trends. In particular, I've observed that in particular postcodes, we get supernormal levels of NDIS service provision that are not explained by demographic factors. Demographic factors do explain it in many cases, but in some suburbs, in some postal areas, the demographic factors do not explain the number of NDIS providers. Conversely, in some postal areas, you get a rather undersupply of NDIS providers relative to other suburbs. These are often in rural areas or remote areas, often areas that have large indigenous populations, but the undersupply potentially of service providers in those locations is a different and distinct problem from the clear oversupply in some locations. And one might wonder whether effectively there's a cottage industry of providers who encourage each other to provide more services, potentially in a circular manner, in all of those areas, particularly the ones with the high over-servicing. And if you've got areas with high over-servicing, that automatically raises the average level of service provision, which means our average might already be over-serviced, but we get even higher levels of over-servicing in some suburbs. Again, something that needs to be tackled with regulators actually scrutinising pockets of potential over-servicing. Now, Mark Butler, the health minister, has attempted to address some of this. The government has announced a plan to get spending growth down to 2% per annum. That appears to be optimistic because the measures they're taking appear to not go to that. You might get a blip down, one off, maybe twice off, but then it is going to keep growing at that higher rate. The reason I say that is they have a plan to reduce the number of people on NDIS by about a third. That would create a reduction in NDIS growth immediately. Furthermore, they have a plan to reduce the amount spent on each NDIS plan, again, by about a third. Now, it appears they are trying to operationalize this through more stringent criteria to get on the NDIS, reassessment of people once they are on the NDIS, the assessment being based on the level of severity of the disability rather than simply whether they have one, and in addition, they appear to be trying to scrutinize more what the spending is on, potentially getting the spending down. However, as you can tell, they're reducing it by about a third. It's not clear to me how this will necessarily get the growth rate down to the 2%. It would certainly reduce it. However, it isn't totally clear it will reduce it by nearly as much as they assert. They're essentially asserting the growth rate is going to be 25% of what it once was, and it appears the measures they're introducing, while really good, aren't necessarily sufficient to get that far. And indeed, for them to get that far, they need to have greater scrutiny over what exactly is being spent, hard caps on expenditure such that rationing occurs if the growth gets too high, and reductions in the amount of things that are actually covered by the NDIS, so that there's not this cottage industry trying to get more and more people onto it. You need significant limits so you do actually get a price signal and rationing coming in. Still, the government is making some steps toward bringing things under control. So in essence, the problem here is the government has been providing rivers of gold to the sector. So, punters, is the problem that it's a privatized system that has the market getting involved and that's causing the spending to get too high? Or punters, is it that the government has gotten involved and you get nearly unlimited spending because the government is just going out throwing up money to be serviced by the private sector? And clearly, it is because the government is just throwing out money. The private sector leaps in to provide that service, but the government is the one who is ultimately sending the wrong signals and creating the wrong incentives. Now, to contrast this with what would happen if the government were to do this, well, it would simply not work at all efficiently. A clear example of this is the NHS. The NHS is a complete trash fire. You get clear rationing in the NHS because, in essence, the government, for example, pays the salary of GPs And GPs realise there's no incentive to work harder because they don't own their practice. So if they're going out and working harder, they get no more money, so they don't. So you get more rationing of hours. It's a clear problem in the NHS, and if one were to fully put the system within the public sector, you're going to get similar problems. The incentives are just terrible when it's entirely public. You don't have an incentive to go out and grow your business or to advance. You just get stagnant, static career advancement and stagnant enterprise. In essence, entrepreneurship goes to die whenever the government gets involved and really digs its teeth in. You're going to get less entrepreneurialism, you're going to get less innovation, you get fewer people who are going to work hard, put in the hours to try to grow their business. Rather, you're just going to get a whole lot of salaried people paid by the government. And if NDIS growth is continuing like it is, well then, it will simply get bloated. And we all know exactly how inefficient the government is. Just look at the $15 billion that went out to the CFMEU in Victoria. Or look at the $2 million being spent on the Greens Party renovation rooms. Or the $2 million being spent on renovating the Greens Party room. Or the sheer waste of money on Anna Cowell's expenditure for travel. There's no shortage of examples of the government wasting money whenever it is internalised. By contrast, when you get the private sector involved, there's an incentive to try to be efficient, when at least the government is not throwing up money willy-nilly. In short, the government is not an efficient or effective steward of our money. The government should be collecting as little money as possible and spending as little money as possible, and if the government just makes all of this state-owned, it is going to become incredibly inefficient and incredibly bloated, as we've seen with all of the expenditure the governments continually get involved in. If you're thinking that the government owning and operating the NDIS and all of the service providers is a good thing, we just look at the budget blowouts and the trash fire that is Victoria. The big build, CFMEU, the trash fire that was the Commonwealth Games that never happened, all of the wasting of money, and the continued budget problems that Victoria has. That's exactly what would face us if the NDIS goes entirely within state hands. Still, you can let me know your thoughts about the NDIS and its growth rate in the comments below. Do you think it's out of control, and do you think the government needs to do something? Or do you think we should just let it continue on with 8% growth rate forever until we ultimately are bankrupted? Let me know what you think in the comments below.